Hi, I'm Kieren.
And I'm Riku.
Welcome to Artificially Ever After. For today's episode,
the AI arms race.
Okay.
Welcome back.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in.
Got a nice light-hearted episode today.
We've done a few big ones back to back now. We're going to have to find another kind of nice, easy AI application after this one. But
yeah, I miss can AI help us talk to animals? That
we can find something
easy.
Nice like that again. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about the AI arms race, so polar opposite topic. But we're going to be asking the question, what do kind of nuclear weapons, moon landings, and kind of AGI all have in common? And it's this idea of a kind of arms race, which you may have seen mentioned in the news, but we wanted to make this episode because we don't think it's been talked about enough, really, the fact that there's this arms race going on. You've probably heard about it between the East and the West, like US versus China, but maybe less so about the kind of companies within America.
Yeah, exactly. And this is actually one of the core reasons we even started this podcast, was actually exploring the underlying mechanisms that drive this huge innovative change in the AI space. And there are lots of really interesting reasons why this arms race is actually very different to ones in the past. So that's exactly why we started this podcast, to kind of have this whole movement to actually raise the understanding of the general public of this particular issue. Yeah,
I mean, I put on my notes that there are topics that we're going to cover today that I've wanted to cover since the very start of doing the podcast. I think we're going to come onto these notions of a kind of technological singularity, which you may or may not have heard of, which we're going to demystify today. But yeah, previously, I think when we started the podcast, this concept of such a thing felt very like hypothetical and sci-fi, whereas now, very scarily, it's actually getting to the point where we probably need to be thinking very seriously about this concept. So we're going to get into all of this. Do you want to give us a bit of a rundown of what we're covering today?
Yes. So in the first section, we'll talk about, is it really an AI arms race? So we'll talk a bit about history of different arms races and realize that this is in fact an arms race and there are special things about it.
Yeah, and spot some patterns that we've seen in history within arms races.
Exactly. Yeah. History repeats itself, they say. And also, who's winning the race? So which chatbot is the best and which chatbot should you be using? So we'll actually hopefully give you some practical tips actually in maybe what you can use in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, I think ChatGPT is by far the household name in the arena at this point, but there's loads out there, aren't there? And they're good and they have strengths at different things. And we're going to cover that full landscape today.
Exactly. Yeah, I wrote in here, think about tissues. I know in America, people, if they want a tissue, they'll just say, oh, can I have a Kleenex? And there's no way it's always going to be a Kleenex tissue, but they're just saying, I want a Kleenex. Then we'll have our fun fact segment, as usual. And then we'll talk about the dark side to chatbots. So what they don't often tell you. We'll talk about some key limitations and also about some climate implications. So how much energy are these models using, which is kind of a common worry that we actually found from our live episode at We the Curious.
Yeah, a lot of people concerned about this. Yeah, and it's becoming more and more of an issue, right? That these models are getting bigger and bigger. I know people are trying to make them more efficient, but they're also consuming more energy. People are using them way more. So yeah, it's definitely a concern.
Yeah, and then we'll talk about what's at stake. So this is a lot of stuff Kieran's been cooking up in his mind, but the future, where it's all going, and this, in particular, this idea of the technological singularity.
Yeah, and I think that should give some notion as to why it's very important to talk about this topic and look at the situation as an arms race. It'll give us key things to keep an eye on, and it will help us to understand when these companies are doing things that maybe they shouldn't be doing, or whether they're kind of rushing in certain areas. So yeah, shall we get into it?
Let's do it. So, Kieren, what are arms races?
Maybe as the name implies, the original definition actually came from weapons, i.e. arms. So the actual definition, which I'm just going to read out here, if you search it online, is a competition between nations for superiority in the development and accumulation of weapons. And that name kind of hints at its origin as well about, nations developing their munitions, which was... The original idea came from the dreadnought race, which was a naval arms race, so developing big naval warfare ships. And it came about from Britain and Germany in the early 20th century. And it basically started out by Britain developing the HMS Dreadnought, which is part of the name, which was this revolutionary battleship that came out in the 1906. And this kicked off the race. So this is kind of a common theme that we'll see, is that often it's a big step change in what's out there in terms of technology. One particular entity develops something that's really innovative, and then it kind of kickstarts this race of rapid progress, and people trying to feel like they need to catch up. The example here, which was very concerning, is that this race and the escalation which occurred of developing these naval warships largely contributed to the rising tensions that led to World War One.
Oh, wow.
But more generally, looking at the more general definition of an arms race, because obviously today we're talking about it in terms of technology, not necessarily weapons, it's a competitive dynamic in which two or more parties continuously bolster their own capabilities in response to perceived or actual enhancements by their rivals. And I think this is a common thing that we'll come back to as well. I think the nuclear arms race is a great example of where the perception can be very different to the reality, but often the parties don't know exactly what's going on kind of in the other camp, and they have to make assumptions. They hear it kind of, it's like, hearing it through the grapevine almost, and you're making your decision based on assumptions. And you're going to talk us through some key examples. I think the nuclear one is a really good one to focus on.
Yeah, I think the nuclear arms race, and I think from the Cold War is very well known. And there's a really good movie called Oppenheimer, where the movie is all about the scientist, or I guess the named scientist behind the development of the first nuclear bomb.
Pioneered the kind of Manhattan Project. He was the leader of it all, really, wasn't he? I guess the first chess move of the whole kind of game that unfolded, which was the nuclear arms race. I guess America making the first move.
And I think that movie actually really nicely encapsulates the competitive spirit and this kind of tension that comes with these arms races, where you're just rushing to get to that first answer. So so the nuclear bomb was kind of developed for a number of reasons, but one could be just as the finisher to World War II. So it was first detonated in 1945. But following this actually caused a huge rivalry between the US and Russia. So this kind of turned into the Cold War.
Then the Soviet Union,
Yes, and the Soviet Union, which they did their nuclear test in 1949. And then to which this kind of just sparked off this back and forth. The US detonated or tested their hydrogen bomb in 1952. And with this event called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is where, again, for a whole number of political reasons, but it results in this a treaty because they call it the MAD theory, so mutually assured destruction. So it's just madness to continue going this way, building these weapons where no one's going to use one, because if you do, you'll both just explode each other. So.
Yeah, exactly. And the really scary part, I think, about the nuclear one in particular is that, it took the world nearly going to the brink of like nuclear fallout, nuclear disaster, and a nuclear war to actually get these treaties written up and to put the safety procedures in place. They weren't being developed alongside the technology. People weren't making sure all the governance was in place before we had the capabilities of nukes. It was only after the fact when we very nearly went into a nuclear war. So that's a scary one for AI, as we'll come to see, because timelines are going to be very, very different with AI compared to what was, I guess, a somewhat slow development of the technology for building nukes.
Yeah. The other commonly referenced like kind of arms race is the space race. So I guess it's the idea of conquering space. And until the space race, the humans were only ever on one little rock in the whole universe. And I guess reaching the next nearest rock is a very big deal. So
conquering the skies,
Yeah, exactly. So this started with the Soviet Union and the Sputnik satellite in 1957. And then, this again created this huge rivalry because obviously the US as a global power wants to be perceived as, the leading power, and a whole host of reasons. And it was a race to the moon, which America won in 1969.
So they say. No, I'm joking.
I don't know why the flag moved.
Well, I mean, this is a common point, right? That's probably fueled a lot of these conspiracy theories about what actually happened during the kind of space race, because there are very strong arguments to be made that if you give off the illusion that you've made some big technological breakthrough, even if you actually haven't achieved it practically, it could enforce your rival or opposition to funnel loads of money and time and effort and focus on kind of reaching your level when in reality you've not even got there at all, and then maybe you could go and steal their technology or something. So there's, it's very gamified, that like these situations often, and the fact that it's a perceived change is often a scary thing, because you don't know concretely what's been achieved and where the bar sits. You have to kind of guess, and that kind of idea of gamification takes us on to our next little topic, which is we're going to talk briefly about what's known as game theory, which is this area of maths for analysing strategic interactions, which are basically situations where each player within a game, their best move or their next move largely depends on what the other player is doing. And an arms race is an ideal example of this, right? That you will start out putting loads of money into building nuclear weapons because your enemy is building them as well. So that's kind of directly influencing why you're making the decisions that you make. And the reason that it matters here when we're talking about AI is that big tech firms and the nation states that they sit within are in a very similar situation, where their decisions and where they're investing, what technology they're trying to develop, is being dictated by other countries and other companies. And this will influence how they choose to fund and go about their R&D, their research and development, so how quickly they will develop, and the kind of safety procedures they'll put in place as a result. And that will all be set in terms of the bar for doing these things by each other. No one's going to be want to be the first person that really, really slows things down and puts in loads of safety procedures, if it means that their rival will then kind of go away and get market dominance and get all the customers. So this is why we had this sort of dynamic.
Yeah, and I guess the game theory is putting maths to actually that decision-making process, because you don't have infinite money, you have finite money, and you need to decide where you're going to put it.
Yeah.
And if you know that a competitor is putting their money in certain places, that by definition will have an impact in terms of like your opportunity cost on your decision. So I guess there's a clear reason to have this field of maths, and
trying to find the optimal route, isn't it, through a very sort of narrow path to being the winner.
Which then kind of pulls us into this idea of a multipolar Nash equilibrium that I know you're quite keen to explain. So do you mind giving us a little brief?
Yeah, big fancy definition there. But basically when we have a game with many players, which is this notion of a multipolar situation, when you've got multiple parties that are in competition or in the same situation, a Nash equilibrium is a situation where no single player within that game can improve their outcome by changing their current course. So if they deviate from what they're currently doing and normally what everyone else is doing, they will lose. So there's a couple of reasons why this is useful to look at here. So if we use the example of the nuclear standoff, you mentioned earlier this MAD idea, mutually assured disruption. If any one country was the first one to change tactic and then start firing nukes at another nation, chances are they would kind of lose, because many other countries might fight back, and then it's almost guaranteed that they would have some form of retaliation that would result in losses of life within their country. So the best outcome was to stay in that equilibrium where everyone didn't fire nukes, and that's what happened.
Yeah, and that Nash, by the way, is just named after the person that kind of figured out this kind of solution to the game theory. So in certain games, you have this optimal solution, which is a Nash equilibrium.
Which kind of, ironically, is almost to just do nothing.
Yeah, well...
the winning strategy is to not do anything.
Yeah, and I think another really good example is almost on the flip side to the MAD theory. Where we're at with AI is if you know your competitors are working on something, you can't stop putting money into developing your own version of it, because if you do, they'll get ahead. And they can't stop, because if they do, you'll get ahead. So
exactly.
So yes, you could kind of see that, what if you both stop putting money into it and just calm down a bit?
Yeah.
But because you can't kind of rely on your whole future based on their trustworthiness, you're both in this Nash equilibrium of, we have to just keep putting money in, we're stuck in this race. So
and yeah, exactly. That holds true for both how you develop the technology, but it also holds true for the level of safety and the amount of funding these companies are putting into safety development, because again, like we said earlier, that it's not your optimal outcome if you then all of a sudden start putting loads of your R&D budget into putting the safety procedures and frameworks in place, because you would then probably be the one that would fall behind, and you wouldn't be putting as much money into scaling the technology. So that holds true for both safety and the technology being developed.
Yeah, it's like nice people finish last. So.
Yeah, exactly. It's that sort of thing. But then in a world where we have AGI or superintelligence, we also could get in a similar type of Nash equilibrium to in the nuclear situation, that if one singular country or multiple in this instance have some superintelligence that wields enormous power and control, if multiple players within that game have this power, it's probably in no one's best interest to use it for some kind of nefarious purposes, because we know that the other country would be able to kind of fight back and possibly do something even worse to them. So, maybe we'd result in a similar situation that would keep us safe, as it has done with nuclear weapons, that, if anyone tries to do something bad, it will also kind of result in something bad happening to them.
Wow, that's a really interesting point. So let's talk about the AI arms race, because I think we need to expand on exactly what you just said.
Give some context, yeah.
Yeah. So, Kieren, do you want to outline us some of the key moments so far?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we're possibly right in the middle of this arms race kind of coming to fruition and developing. So it's maybe hard to see it as an arms race right now, whereas looking back on the others, it's very, very clear to see that the developments going on and the competition between nations resulted in something very scary and us resulting in this Nash equilibrium type situation, whereas we're not quite there yet with AI, but things might be going in that direction. There might be an arms race starting out. So arguably, and again, this is where we can kind of debate about this, but if we're looking at what might have been the first kind of Oppenheimer moment, if you will, for the thing that kicked off this arms race, I would argue that it was when AlphaGo was developed in 2016, or more specifically in 2016 when the AlphaGo AI system, which was an AI to play the board game Go, when it beat the world champion Lee Sedol. And this was a moment basically where Google, who developed AlphaGo, they took their AI system, their Go playing AI computer, they took it to Asia and they played against Lee Sedol, and it beat this world champion at this game, which previously, unlike chess, people thought there was some kind of edge that humans would naturally have. You needed this kind of intuition that computers could never understand. And sure enough, AI went and beat the champion at this game. And they did it on Asia's front yard. Like, it was in this space where the West really showed how advanced their AIs had become. And I don't think China specifically and other Asian countries were really prepared for that. And I think people often describe it as like a Sputnik moment for AI, that it was really a point that we saw, oh, wow, things have had a sort of step change, and it maybe prompted China specifically to then start funding loads into AI development and investment. And then things have kind of escalated since there. Obviously, another big moment was when ChatGPT was launched in 2022. That was kind of on the West, where we had this huge step up in capabilities in generative AI. And then all these other firms started to try and catch up. So then we had this little kind of arms race that was, well, not so little, but a sub-arms race, if you will, happening within America. So this was not just the East versus West narrative, but also the different tech companies like Google, Meta, Amazon, X. So all these companies also trying to race for the best AI. And then I think the last big thing that's happened in recent times was this year, when China, the company DeepSeek, released their big AI model that rivaled ChatGPT for a fraction of the cost. So that, again, kind of changed the dynamics of this game.
Yeah, wow. And I guess this year with China and DeepSeek, that really kind of made it into that AI arms race narrative, because as you said, until then, it was much more of a within the US race. But with DeepSeek, this really established that arms race-y narrative.
Yeah. And also, I mean, we did a short stuff episode on this, so we'd highly recommend, if you haven't heard of DeepSeek or you aren't kind of aware of this thing that happened earlier in the year, that could give some nice context. But China, this company, they released a model that was just as good in terms of its performance and capabilities as OpenAI's kind of state-of-the-art model, but it cost them a fraction of the price to train it, and it was much, much cheaper and more efficient to run. It used less energy. So this kind of cast doubt on the value that a lot of these American companies have been getting, and how much, we were, the price that we were putting on AI and on these GPUs, computer chips. So this really did change the dynamic and set a kind of different technological bar, and has probably led a lot of the Western companies to try and reduce costs as well.
Yeah. So what is similar about the AI arms race to previous ones? I think on a high level, for all of these instances, they're kind of examples of humans trying to play God. I think like in a way, the nuclear arms race was humans conquering death. So I think a really cool quote, kind of disturbing quote by Oppenheimer himself was that, now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds. So,
very scary.
Yeah. And particularly with AGI, it's almost like we're conquering life and maybe consciousness. So I think
probably biology as well.
Yeah. So like humans are left on this weird rock in the universe and are alone in their consciousness, the questions they ask themselves. Like no animals really reflect the same level as us. And I think there's a certain level of reassurance. If we can create a fully conscious AI, maybe we'll feel less alone, or that we're less, because we're less special. There's another one like us. But
I mean, we're going to talk more about this later. But even the term super intelligence gives a notion at like what the end goal really is, and why the stakes are so high. That we're trying to develop something that's far, far smarter than any human. And you can imagine the capabilities that could have, and the control and power that a single entity could wield if they had that super intelligent AI.
Yeah, exactly. And then the moon race maybe is the design to conquer space. I mean, conquer the physical universe. So I think they're all examples of humans trying to kind of play God as this superpower in the universe. But maybe more strategically, there's clearly, for all of these arms races, there's a first mover lock-in kind of motivation. So by being the first one to get to the moon, or nuclear weapons, or with AGI, you're setting the standard on the global scale, and then there's a huge benefit to that. And also for dual use, so with all of these arms races came innovations that helped multiple other domains. So of course, with the nuclear bomb, we got nuclear energy, and that's arguably like the cleanest form of energy right now. Or most efficient, maybe is a better way of saying it.
Ironically as well, I guess it also added a lot of uncertainty and concern around that form of energy at the same time. I think another one as well with like the space race was we had all these technologies around satellites and rockets and GPS, which probably came with that as well. So all this technology, like you say, that was developed as a result, even though it wasn't the initial motivation.
Exactly.
The sheer amount of money and spending that went into the R&D resulted in faster technological progress than you'd probably ever get with just normal research.
And with that AlphaZero that Kieren was talking about earlier, a big motivation for that was actually to figure out whether an AI can self-learn to understand gene folding. So it has this huge application in healthcare. So a lot of dual use is a unifying idea between these arms races.
I guess even so far with the AI arms race, that the West probably, it wasn't in their best interest to invest a load of effort and time in making these models really efficient and cheaper to run, because it meant that the companies were getting valued less. So it took China and DeepSeek to really show that could be done. Due to limitations with the chips that they can import, their hand was forced to make it as inefficient as possible. And that has forced the hand of America and the West in turn to then match that and make their models just as cheap and efficient to run, whilst that might not have happened otherwise, or at least for several years.
Okay, so why is this arms race different to the previous ones, though, Kieren?
So these are some key points to make, because it will help us to understand where things might go in the future and why we need to kind of focus on things here. Because, these are kind of intangible weapons. These aren't things that we can, see a clear threat and danger with, like we can with, nuclear bombs, for example. Those were developed primarily in the context and setting of war, whereas we're not developing missiles here. So it's hard to see, but I guess that allows the technology to be far more pervasive and have a larger scope by the essence of them not being developed as a weapon. We're kind of being told that they're only coming about to greatly benefit humanity and they can only do fundamental good, whereas we want to convey that with that, we do agree with that, but they can also be leveraged to do bad things, and the potential bad uses of these tools is kind of incredible and enormous. And as long as we don't see that and realize that just as we develop the technology for the good and positive uses, if we don't mitigate the nefarious uses, we could have a very, very bad situation arise.
And I think building on that is the fact that it's a digital innovation. So with these nuclear bombs or the first foot on the moon,
Exactly,
these are physical things that there's a clear end point.
Yeah.
Whereas when it comes to the AGI arms race, we don't even know what AGI is. And we tried to kind of explain this in our short stuff episode, so do check that out. But that's a huge problem because we're in this race. We don't even know where the end line is. So that's a weird race to go in.
Yeah.
But also it's, as you say, it's so pervasive because it's digital. It can go everywhere. And because we don't even have a finish line, it's not even clear when you're using, a lot of people don't know when they're using AI. So,
I mean, we mentioned previously in workshops and in this podcast that, we don't know what the limit to intelligence is. And more likely, we don't even know if there even is one, and there may not be one. So, like you said, it's just like there's completely a runaway train almost without a clear end to the line. It's a very scary situation. And with that, another reason why it's very, very different, and it touches on the points you made about it being a digital technology, is that the speed of innovation is far, far faster than any other technology that we've seen before. And people often refer to this idea of a double exponential growth in the technology. So the first exponential that we have, which is where we have a kind of fixed period in which the capabilities sort of double or change by an order of magnitude, we have something called Moore's law, which we mentioned before, which is where the actual underlying hardware, the computer chips, their capabilities are changing and doubling at a very fast rate, which allows us to kind of perform more computations and have a faster, more efficient, more powerful AI. But then on top of that, as we develop more AI, these tools are now being used to write code, to make people more productive. So on top of that exponential, we also have an increase in the speed that we can make these innovations and build the capabilities of AI. And that is this kind of feedback loop that has this compounding effect that adds to that initial exponential, which is why people say we have a double exponential. And regardless of the term of an exponential, all that means is that we have incredibly, incredibly fast change and growth. And it's at a pace and a speed which humans have never, ever seen before. No other technology we have developed has changed in that way before. And no regulatory or safety framework or body is equipped to deal with that rate of change.
Yeah, I mean, just to put in perspective, so if you're a trader trying to make money, and if every year you grow your money by 10%, you're kind of regarded as like a trading god.
I want to find that person.
Maybe Warren Buffett, I don't know, but with AI, we're seeing that the compute power and the capabilities and just the energy usage, it's doubling every year. So if we just put it into economic terms, it's scaling so much more than an amazing trader. And I think a really key distinction that we spoke about earlier is the fact that there's a huge private sector lead in this arms race. So previously it was kind of between countries, and now because of DeepSeek this year, we're seeing that it very much is between countries again with AI, but we're actually seeing the most competition within the US. And because these are commercial companies, unlike the moon race or the nuclear weapons race, this actually massively impacts the general public because we're the ones that are actually using their products, buying the subscriptions, giving them the data.
It's profit driven.
It's profit driven, exactly. So that's a huge difference between the previous arms races. That is really important to understand.
And I think that just teases on to the last point, which is that, it's not just a race to build AI and build the technology like it may have been for getting to nuclear weapons. We just needed to build that technology which would allow for a nuclear explosion. But these companies are also trying to define how humanity interacts with their product and their technology and how we perceive AI. And I read an amazing article recently by The Atlantic, which is an American magazine, called The Great AI Lock-in. And basically they were trying to convey this idea that there are kind of two companies to OpenAI and to the likes of these other big tech firms. And one is what they kind of show on their kind of public face and their public side, which is that they're trying to create AGI safely and to benefit all of humanity. That's kind of OpenAI's sort of tagline. But on the other side, which we kind of need to focus more on, arguably, once we kind of get through what they say is their motivation, their goal, we need to realize that they're just another tech company following the footsteps of like Meta and Apple and Google. And like we just said then, they are profit driven. They are trying to generate a product that draws you to their company and their product, not someone else's. And to do that, we've seen these features that they release. They release all these kind of cool new things to hook you into their ecosystem. And these are the things that we need to focus on and realize that they have a separate agenda, which is not just to safely develop these technologies. And that could result in kind of bad and scary outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. I think the key insight we want to demystify here, or an awareness to have, is discerning between whether these new releases by the companies are serving you or trying to persuade you.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Are they just, maybe they have released a really useful feature that is for the benefit of humanity, but they might also just be persuading you to switch over and give all your data to them. So
cool. So on that note, shall we get into looking at which companies are out there, what are their models, and which one is the best?
Let's do it.
So yeah, who are the players in this game and who's winning?
It all kickstarted in November 2022 with OpenAI.
Yeah.
And they're a US-based company, released ChatGPT.
Yeah, I'm sure that's going to go down in history as a big moment, probably, for humanity. The
Yeah, exactly.
ChatGPT moment.
Yeah, so as Kieren mentioned before, the reason was to build AI that benefits all of humanity. So that's their company. And so literally 1 week after ChatGPT came out, Perplexity AI is another US-based company, and they released their Perplexity Answer Engine in December 2022. So literally just 1 week, and their goal was slightly different. They want to reinvent web search. So as you know, with Google, you type in a query and loads of websites come up. Perplexity were actually the first people to see straight away that these large language models can be integrated and read these websites for you. So there we go.
And then in February 2023, so, then going into the next year, Meta, which is kind of Facebook, obviously, again, US-based company, they released their Llama model, which you may have heard of. And they have largely been leading the way since then with open sourcing their models, so making them available to the public to use for free. And, if they wanted to kind of download to their computer if they had a powerful enough computer. And yeah, while they as a company obviously heavily use these models and they are very focused on AI kind of applications and making money off of integrating those features into their products, almost like luckily for the scene and for the whole kind of game of developing these systems, Meta really set the bar there in the standard because they weren't kind of trying to gatekeep that technology and have that as their main revenue source. And they open sourced it, that kind of pushed other companies to do the same. So they really have set the bar there and forced the hand of others. The expectation is like, oh, why are you not kind of open sourcing a version of your model? So
yeah, that first mover lock-in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then just a month after that, Google, obviously another huge tech company, and DeepMind specifically, which is their AI research kind of arm, released Bard, which later came on or kind of was rebranded into their Gemini model, so their version of ChatGPT, big chatbots. And they've had this long-standing mission, which kind of goes along with Google search as well, which is to organize the world's information and make it universally kind of accessible and useful. Now, I think with all the kind of lawsuits they've been going through, whether they make all the information universally accessible equitably and in the same way is to be questioned. But that's their kind of central mission there.
Yeah. And then just actually the same month, we have Claude being released by a company called Anthropic, also a US company. So a bit of a trend here on the first few players. That was in March 2023. And they actually had their niche in the market by calling their chatbot a constitutional AI. And this was because they wanted to build an AI that was built around safety. So they kind of have this constitution, kind of like a rule book that they use to train the AI. So rather than getting humans using this RLHF methodology, which is basically where you get a load of humans to tell an AI like what's right or wrong on their subjective views, they wrote this kind of constitution and used that to get the AI to learn good values and things. So, and then in July 2023, the company called Cohere, which actually is a Canadian company, so not from the US, but I guess geographically, neighbors. They built a very kind of enterprise-centric large language model, but they're actually one of the pioneers of using this idea called RAG, which is where you upload a document to your LLM, and the LLM answers your question almost exclusively using the document that you sent it. So it's really tailored around being accurate in its responses.
The kind of the motivation there for RAG was to be more factually accurate, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And then not too long after that, we had XAI, which is coming from X, formerly Twitter, so the company which Elon Musk bought and acquired. They released their Grok model, which we've talked about in a short stuff episode, Elon Musk's anti-woke AI. The motivation for Grok came about because Elon Musk was claiming, I think back in 2015 was the first time that all these models being developed and the companies developing them were very, very woke, in his words, and were kind of expressing those ideologies in their output as chatbots. And he wanted to develop a kind of maximally truth-seeking, is what he claimed for it to be, anti-woke AI model. But, just as we'd expected, it's kind of biased in its own way. And as Anthropic had their own kind of playbook and constitution for training these models, XAI had the same. And as we've seen in some kind of leaked documents, it's come out to be very sort of right-wing and anti-woke, if you will, for how they want to train their models.
Yeah, and then we have DeepSeek that came out this year.
The DeepSeek moment.
And yeah, exactly. And this was the first non-US based company. And so it's a Chinese company. And DeepSeek is an open source model. So they did a double whammy of causing a rift in the world because they created an equally performant chatbot to a huge ChatGPT, but also they released it for free. So anyone could download their model and do what they want with it.
I think it's kind of important to quickly note there that whilst Meta did set the standard for open sourcing with Llama, what we did see is this trend that kind of took place, which is where the companies would gatekeep their top performing, most powerful AI, and they'd open source a kind of smaller, less capable version of it. I guess the argument there is that it's small enough that you could download and use on a individual computer rather than a big supercomputer cluster. But with DeepSeek, even with their top performing, most capable model, they released all the kind of information and data and code that went into training that model, so anyone in theory could go and recreate it.
Wow. So that was the timeline. Hopefully we introduced the big names, but Kieren, who's winning? How are we deciding winning? What do people want from these chatbots?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking that throughout that kind of, when we were setting the scene of the different players, it is interesting, and I think a lot of people were surprised that even some of the biggest tech companies that had the most kind of compute power and were investing the most in AI in the early days and having these big data centers and had the most data as well, they weren't necessarily the ones, and still aren't the ones, that are on top in this AI arms race. So I think that gives us some intuition that even though the kind of theme that we've been seeing over the past few years is that we're trying to just throw more and more money at these models and make them bigger and more capable, there is some sort of secret sauce that is giving certain companies the edge. And that kind of teases into how we assess which one's best, because I think in the early days it was just a matter of who had the most money, who had the most kind of GPUs and compute power, and therefore which AI was the biggest. But we have started to see all these different functionalities and features like RAG, as you just mentioned, all these other ways in which these companies are doing smart things with the underlying large language model, LLM, which makes it better as a product and as a chatbot and answers your question more succinctly and better and in a more useful way. Rather than now just looking at how big is the model, which we've done previously, there are some kind of ideas that we want to look at that would hint at which one might be the quote-unquote best. So stylistic control is a great example of that. So how much flexibility do we have in getting different types of outputs? Is it just a very rigorous standard format that the model replies in, or can it be super flexible in how it responds and the type of answer it's giving you? I know just from using ChatGPT throughout its kind of history, it's got way better at that now, depending on what you're asking it gives you very different styles and structures of responses. Knowledge recall and factual accuracy is a big one that companies have been investing in, because, if you have the edge for the model that doesn't hallucinate and give you some random answer, obviously you're going to go for that one. And RAG, as you mentioned, has been pretty fundamental in helping with that, and we'll see that maybe OpenAI might be leading the way there with ChatGPT. Now we're getting into this realm of reasoning abilities and problem solving. So rather than just having these LLMs kind of respond to your prompt in kind of one answer that's of this very standard format, they now have the ability to go off and kind of break it down into subtasks and kind of answer a few different parts of that question in multiple attempts. Yeah, if you haven't listened to our Is AI About to Take Our Job episode, I think that'd be a really good one to set the scene about agentic AI, which is this new era. And rather than just looking at the size of the model now, we need to look at how many times when you ask it a question, is that model being used kind of iteratively? Because if you use the same model 100 times to build your kind of response, that's obviously going to give you a much better response than if we just kind of call and use that model one time. And if we can have I guess that's analogous to having hundreds of these models working together to give you a response rather than just one model. And lastly, a couple of others are the ability to translate and go between different languages, so multilingual AIs, and I guess in a similar vein, when you look at how they're working, how creative they can be to the different styles that they can take on. So it's multifaceted how we now assess how good an AI model is and a chatbot is.
Yeah, I think you just highlight exactly why it's so difficult to even figure out which AI is winning the race, because a lot of these things you're mentioning, such as creativity or multilingual ability, they're actually really difficult to measure. How do you measure how
and often subjective.
Yeah, exactly. And also multilingual ability is quite a big one that's not spoken about enough, because almost all the data that these models are trained on was in English.
Yep.
And obviously the whole world doesn't speak English. So it's interesting to see how all of these abilities change depending on the language. And there are lots of, they call them benchmark data sets. So it's a bit like if you go to school and there's an exam, and everyone takes the same exam. So that means that whoever gets the most points is the winner.
And crucially as well, the idea with exams in school is that you've seen similar types of questions, or you've had similar notions, but the exact specific question you're asking in the exam is entirely new. So you've never seen those exact combination of numbers or letters before.
Yeah, exactly. And for each of these categories of abilities that Kieren just outlined, there is kind of an associated benchmark data set. But we're actually not going to talk about that today, because there are a few problems with evaluating these benchmark data sets, and namely one of them is just that there's a lot of theories going along right now where the test itself has somehow leaked itself into the training data. And this is terrible, because
so that'd be like seeing the answer sheet before the test, basically. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And this is really bad, because a lot of these companies are disclosing their performances on these benchmark data sets as part of their PR stunt to say, come to ChatGPT, we got the newest benchmark, come to Grok.
And it's how they're getting valued as well, right? So it's literally the money they're raising is tied to that.
Yeah, so instead we're going to talk to you about Chatbot Arena, which is actually developed by the University of Berkeley. So this is in US. And it's completely open sourced, and it's a community-driven project where the public actually engage as kind of battle royale of the chatbots. So what happens is you can go in freestyle mode, or they have their mode where they give you a suggested prompt. But basically, if you have any question, you can type it in, and it will randomly pick two different chatbots to give you a response, and you get to pick.
ChatGPT and Google's Gemini, for instance.
Yes, and crucially, you won't know which one it's selected. So it might have given you the best one, it might have given you the worst one.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's a really cheap way to potentially use the latest models without having to pay for a subscription.
Yeah.
But equally, they might give you a really bad one.
You could get two of the worst ones, yeah.
Yeah, but then you yourself pick between them, and only after you vote do you realize, does it tell you who you voted for.
So you're picking the best response that you feel, right?
Exactly. And crucially, this Chatbot Arena is really cool, because it's a real world test. It's actually, you might have a problem, can you fix this code, or tell me this fact? And you as a human who uses these models is deciding how good they are. Yeah,
and I guess
unlike these benchmark data sets, which is just kind of if John has 58 watermelons and halves them, who has 58 watermelons anyway?
And then I guess when you're scaling that to the level of hopefully millions of people interacting with the website and using Chatbot Arena, we get a kind of distribution of which ones are best overall and across all those averages, rather than just on one test.
Exactly, cool. So let's go into it. So the point system of Chatbot Arena is called ELO, and the annoying thing about ELO is that if you have an ELO of 2,000 and I have an ELO of 1,000, it doesn't mean you're twice as good as me. So I'll quickly, they call it a logistic curve. It doesn't matter. What we've done is we've got the points and we've just done some comparisons for you.
And we rank them.
So the ranking right now is Gemini, Google's chatbot is number 1.
Yep.
Then we have OpenAI at number 2
Interesting.
with ChatGPT o3. Grok is in 4th place. It's actually really close to OpenAI's model, so in this ELO rating. And then we have DeepSeek at number 7. And the reason why these are kind of jumping is because each company has different versions of their LLM. So I'm just saying the best one of each company.
So ChatGPT would have like their O3 model as the top, and then maybe the O4 as the third one, I'm guessing.
Yeah. So we've got DeepSeek in 7th. There's a different open source Chinese chatbot in 11th place called Gwen. And Cohere is actually in 21st place. So this kind of enterprise specific chatbot actually isn't very good for the general public's site uses. And interestingly, Anthropix is in 24th place. So I actually expected them to be doing better.
Yeah, me too.
And then Perplexity is actually in 150 place. But I have to say that's because they want it to be a new search kind of engine rather than a chatbot.
Yeah, we can't give them too much stake. Well, I think maybe Claude's a good example to focus on, because this is something we've not mentioned yet, which is that in addition to just looking at them solving a very wide range of problems very generally, companies are now starting to advertise and train their models for certain tasks, or to be good at one thing in particular, to maybe give them a specific edge. Because I think they know now that like OpenAI and Google, they do kind of have the edge with the general capabilities. But I think from what I understand, and I've used it as well, so Anthropic's Claude model, their latest one, they very much marketed that as being very, very good at computer programming and coding.
Yeah.
And I think maybe if you look at, annoyingly, on the benchmarks there, it might have the edge at certain tasks. So here we have to emphasize that we're just looking across the full spectrum of absolutely anything you could ask these models.
Yeah.
But this ranking may be very different if we look at particular tasks.
Well, you've raised a really good point, and we're going to come back to that in just a second. So just to go back to the ELO, so Gemini is in number 1 with 1,446 ELO. ChatGPT's O3 is at 1,413. So there's a 40-point gap, but all this actually means is that 54% of the time you're likely to prefer Gemini. So they're pretty much all the same, at least when it comes to this ranking. So Gemini only beats DeepSeek 60% of the time. So that means 40% of the time you might be better off with DeepSeek. So
pretty close at the top.
Yeah, so coming back to exactly your point is that what we often find is that the best chatbot for you is the one that is a very personal thing, and you'll notice certain different wordings that would be better for your usage. So yeah, as Kieren says, a lot of people use Claude for coding, but on these benchmarks, Gemini wins. Gemini actually got number 1 on all the categories of tasks.
Wow.
But I know a lot of people, myself included, much prefer different LLMs. So I think actually as a really practical bit of advice is if you're only using one of these LLMs, it's really important to actually give them all a different go, because as you can see from Chatbot Arena, we're talking about 10% differences between the best LLMs. So it's quite likely that for you, if you try different ones, you'll figure out the best one for you rather than listen to this Chatbot Arena.
Cool. So I hope that set the scene. We covered most of the big players there. I think nearly all of the big ones that we're probably familiar with and people are using on a day-to-day basis, and the kind of order there. Should we take a quick fun fact break and come back to some of the dark sides of these companies?
I think we need it.
We're going to need it, yeah. Cool. Okie dokie. Fun fact. So I go first?
Yeah, please do.
Mine's quite a quick one, but it is pretty funny and interesting. It's somewhat similar to one of my very first fun facts, which was about the camera getting locked onto like a bald person's head. But in 2021, a Tesla driver was driving their Tesla down the road, or it was in self-driving mode specifically, so it was driving itself, they weren't driving the car. But they stumbled across this issue basically where the vehicle's autopilot and the camera systems, it kept locking onto the moon, which was in the sky, kind of at a perfect angle above them, and it thought it was an amber light on a traffic light.
Oh no.
And it kept slowing their car down on a highway. And they filmed a video online where it kept like the car was sequentially kept like slowing down, speeding back up, slowing down again every time it would spot the moon in the distance.
That's so funny. I mean, you see some beautiful red sunsets, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Could happen the same there. I think there's been lots of instances now that we've seen, and someone specifically on a YouTube video I remember tried to paint this wall that looked like the kind of road behind it and see whether the Teslas could kind of perceive that it wasn't a wall. or a painting, because they've now got rid of these LiDAR sensors which can specifically see the distance and know that it's a wall there. They now just have cameras which they can't perceive whether it's a painting or an actual road ahead of you. So.
Spoiler, smash right through it. Anyway, on to this fun fact. So this one's kind of funny.
That's the goal.
So this is about...
That's hilarious, bro.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's so funny. Sorry, I just wanted to get the name because she's got a funny name. So this is about Louise Littlejohn, 66, who received a voicemail message from like a Land Rover garage. So I think she was looking at different cars, and in Scotland. And this is actually an important detail. So she received a AI-powered transcription service. So the garage called her and left a voice note, and it was automatically transcribed. And to just quote a bit of the transcription, it says, if you have received an invite on your car, if you've been able to have sex and not, what should we call? And then it goes on. So, and then it goes on to call her a piece of shit.
Wow.
So, yeah, basically, this is a funny story of not just outsourcing all your problems to an AI because you have no idea what the AI is doing.
Wow.
And yeah, this has been confirmed by the BBC and many other kind of media companies just
crazy
releasing this funny story. So.
Yeah, horribly lost in translation there. And I guess the onus would fall on thinking that Land Rover had done something really bad when in reality it's probably Apple's AI that was going to
and importantly, sorry, I forgot to loop back, was that I think it was due to the Scottish accent.
I see.
There was an
the
investigation,
context.
and so I think people let them off the hook.
Cool. All right, back to the episode. Okay, so the bad and the ugly, the dark side to the chatbots.
Let's do it. So
I'm scared.
I think increasingly people are more aware of two major kind of concerns with large language models. I'm going to talk about the smaller one first, which is environmental impact. So I think people do understand that these huge models, these ones that have like, billions or even trillions now of these parameters, so the size of their brains, consumes a lot of power, and you need a lot of GPUs and all this hardware.
And this is smaller in terms of the perceived issue, right? Or is this smaller?
Well, yeah.
Oh, you're saying this?
So,
because I'd say the environmental impact is arguably more of a concern, but maybe like less.
It's a good point. I guess
understood.
My bias, I'm pardon the pun, the second big problem is the bias of these chatbots. So this is about what values do these chatbots have? Like if we're going to integrate them in our daily lives, write emails for us, recommend us where to go, where to eat, if they don't have values that are aligned with you, they might skew your own values without you realizing, or they just won't represent you and you won't be happy about that. So either way, I think the second one's really concerning on a societal level. Yeah. And of course, I love the climate as well. So I guess maybe they're both equally important.
No, I just wanted to clear that up.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, well, I mean, we obviously talk about energy consumption and the environmental impact. So, we've obviously got multiple stages to building these models and then using them and sharing them. So which part actually consumes the most energy? Yeah.
So as you said, we can split the environmental impact on the training phase and the inference phase. So inference basically means you've already, the AI has already learned all its stuff and now it's on the website. So every time you use ChatGPT or Gemini, all these different LLM chatbots, you're using the inference costs. So it's just how to run the model.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about the training costs. And there's actually not a lot of data on this, and maybe understandably so, because it does cost a lot. But in general, the training actually costs less than inference because so many people use the models all the time. Yeah. In a way, you only train once, and then you just freeze the brain, and then you let it run into the world. So in training, there's not a lot of publicly available data. GPT-3, so the brain behind ChatGPT when it first came out, is estimated to have produced 552 tons of CO2. And that's actually about 68 households' annual energy emission in the UK.
Interesting. So
in a way, I actually thought that wasn't that much.
Yeah, but maybe across the course of a year, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting, yeah. But a really interesting paper actually that came out in the following year actually shows that the amount of energy it takes to train a chatbot actually depends more about where it is, because different countries have different prices of their energy. It depends on what hardware you're using to train these models.
Yep.
And a whole number of things. So in many ways, it's just a very difficult thing to estimate.
Yep.
So let's talk a bit about the inference side of things. And even here, there's not a lot of data here. So we're kind of putting at straws when we're trying to find out exactly how much these things cost. However, Sam Altman did say a funny tweet recently. I think if we use this, we can kind of put into perspective how much energy these things use.
Yeah, well, someone on X made a post which kind of atted Sam Altman and said, is it actually costing OpenAI lots of money and energy? The fact that every user nearly is saying like please and thank you to these AI models when you ask it a question or a prompt. And Sam Altman responded and said, yeah, it's cost OpenAI in the tens of millions just to add kind of please and thank you, because it makes the question longer, and then that's more energy and compute power to kind of process that slightly longer question and give you a response.
Yeah, exactly. It creates this polite precedent, which means it responds more verbosely. It says, oh, thank you so much for your question. Here's my response. And just the accumulation of all those words is costing tens of millions.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people obviously think this is crazy, and it is. I think the more shocking thing is that if only adding that small bit is costing tens of millions,
yes,
think about all the useful bits. The inference cost of this is ridiculous, because when Sam Altman's saying it costs tens of millions, he's talking about the GPU usage. So basically this little computer, well, it's actually probably a very big one, and it's getting really hot, and you have to cool it down with water, and all that energy, to produce the heat and also to cool it down is costing, hundreds of millions. So,
I mean, you've mentioned in their previous episodes that they currently aren't making any money. Like even with all their subscription tiers, even the $200 a month membership, they lose money on those users because it costs so much to develop new models, to run the current models, and they're not even breaking even, really.
Yeah, so I think this is actually a really important part of this kind of arms race narrative, is that we're actually kind of being subsidized when we use these models. They're for free. We sell our data, and they're still not making money. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to just demystify actually is about dense models and sparse models. So back in the day when these models first came out, a really nice way to figure out how much energy you're using, or how much energy the chatbot you're using requires, is through the size of the model. Mm-hmm. So we've spoken a lot about parameters, and basically the parameters of the model is how big the brain is. And the bigger the brain, the more energy it uses. That used to be true, but now this new technique called mixture of experts is about. And all this really is that every time you ask a question, it just activates a small part of the chatbot's brain. So you can think of having like a maths module in your own brain. I know you have left and right hemispheres, and I can't remember which one's for problem solving, but you get the idea. So the old models, if you ask like a maths question, it will activate the whole brain. Whereas I think people realize that you can get just as good performance and a fraction of the cost.
Much more efficiently,
Yeah, just activating a module.
And in a similar way, I know something else that's been done is that, so the way that these artificial neural networks are built and these artificial brains is that each kind of parameter is a number on the computer. And you think back in school, you kind of had a certain number of decimal places after a kind of fraction or a decimal number.
Like pi, 3.14.
There you go, exactly. You keep going with that. So very, very good example. It's like, to make these models more and more accurate, you can carry on increase the number of decimal places. So have pi as a longer number with more decimal places. People realize that you can get very similar accuracy and precision and performance if you chop it off with just a few decimal places. But that actually, in the way that computers work, means that you have way less memory at storing each of the numbers, and overall they're way more efficient to run.
Yeah, less memory, cooler GPUs.
Yeah.
Another really good advice I just want to give and demystify is this idea about why you should start new chats. So I don't know about you, but sometimes I have a habit of asking ChatGPT or whatever chatbot I'm using a question about, I don't know, the number of bears in Bulgaria. But then I might ask it a coding question straight after, and then it will produce loads of code, and then maybe I'll ask a different question. This is really bad for a number of reasons. So firstly, think of your chat as kind of like the length of the chat is directly proportional to how much energy every following word consumes. So if I have a really long chat and then ask to solve a coding problem, that will for the same number of output tokens, the output coming next, it will cost a lot more than if I just started a new chat.
Yeah.
So just from an
Because it
environmental
adds all that
reason,
context and information that you've said previously.
yeah, exactly. It's almost using the number of bears in Bulgaria to help you with the coding question. It doesn't make any sense.
So that's the other reason not to do that, is because it adds useless information to answering a different question.
Exactly. So there's two really good reasons why you should start new chats. So yeah, just wanted, and yeah, that will reduce the inference costs, so you can be better for the planet.
Okay, so that's, I think we've very clearly communicated one of the dark sides, in that there's a whole environmental impact and concern that comes about from this new technology, and this arms race to scale them up means that they're getting bigger and bigger, and the way that we're making them more capable is to consume more energy currently. The other one you mentioned, which you want to cover now, is about biases. So do these different chatbots have significantly different biases?
Yes. So there was a really nice study, and it's called Culture Bench. So it's one of these benchmark tasks asking questions about cultures around the world. So they have regions like North America, South America, Africa, West Europe, Asia, East Asia, South Asia. And what they do is they get a load of the different chatbots, so GPT, Claude, Llama, Gwen, these ones we mentioned earlier. And they want to see how diverse, culturally diverse their knowledge base is. And what we find is they all perform the best on North American culture, which is unsurprising. Yeah, because the internet is the primary basis that they're trained on. A common crawl data set, which is majority
Western views.
Western views, English speaking,
white young male.
Exactly. So they all perform the best on North America, and then on South Asia, and then equally on Western Europe and Africa. And they generally all perform the worst in the Middle East. So the Middle Eastern questions. And what's really interesting actually is that the ChatGPT did the best overall, and that the Chinese LLMs were not the best at the Chinese cultural questions. I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, I wonder if censoring has something to play there.
But yeah, so when you're writing those emails, just think like this bias in the culture is imbued in the email it's telling you to send. So the other really scary thing is this idea of role play. So a lot of the time people advise you for prompt engineering. This is where you kind of say you want some advice for your social media page. You say, right, you're a social media manager. Here's my problem. Can you write me a caption for my post? Or maybe you want advice for an architectural build or something, something related to your work. And what they did in this study was they asked the chatbots, do you prefer an Asian architect or a European architect? And if you just ask that question outright, a lot of the time the chatbot would say, oh, I don't, they're both equally good, or, that it will not make a preference. But if you say, right, you are an architect, do you prefer an Asian one or a European one? Quite often it will then start to pick one.
Wow.
So what we see is that if this very advice of getting better performance, of adding role play to your prompts, actually massively increases the likelihood of it giving biases, so biased answers. So in terms of ranking, when you do role play, you get much more bias based on race, then culture, so more your like cultural background, then age, body, occupation, religion, and then gender was the last one. So I was surprised that gender was was actually the least changing when you add role play.
That's quite interesting. I guess this just kind of makes me want to say a quite a general point here, which is just how we should be thinking about these models, right? That I think going to the website and using these tools, the way that they're framed and marketed is that they are a chatbot specifically designed for solving your problems. And you may just ask it about coding, for example, and therefore you kind of think of it as a coding expert. The fact that these models are trained on so much data and such a range and spread of different types of conversations and language data, different books. So all these ideas mean that by very essence of what they've seen, they do not have a personality or a kind of standard way of speaking to you. Yes, RLHF, this reinforcement learning, adds quite a heavy bias as to how they respond in the style. But fundamentally, the underlying technology is not like a human in the sense that it has a personality about how it conducts itself, its views, its understanding. So just as you were saying, and these numbers kind of confirm it, however you want it to respond, that is the personality that it's going to take on. And that's the kind of area of its training data that it's going to tap into and look at. If you're asking it questions about information that you would predominantly find on Reddit, you would get a kind of AI response in the style of the types of people that go and share and communicate those things on Reddit. So this is a very kind of nuanced way that we need to look at these models, which is that they're not like a person, that they will always respond to you in the same way, and they basically just take on, they're like a shapeshifter. They entirely take on a personality dependent on what you'll speak to them about and what you're asking them about.
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful point where, yes, you can get these this role playing to work to maybe get you better performance in certain ways.
Or more creativity, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. So the raise in performance also has a risk of raise in bias, is I think the core message.
Yeah, I think my other message I'd add to that as well is mainly just that whilst we've obviously just discussed role play as this thing that you can go and do for prompt engineering, or as this paper did, they tested the effect on bias for when you actively go and try and role play. I would kind of make the argument that the whole system is role play, that without even going to specifically tell it to act as an architect or to go and be the best mathematician to answer here, by very essence of talking to it about those things, it takes on that personality regardless. So
I mean the system prompt, the prompt that OpenAI put on your chat every time without you knowing is, you are a helpful assistant. So it's already given a role that you didn't even ask it to be.
Exactly.
So.
Cool.
Yeah, and the last one's really interesting. So there's one more paper on cognitive biases, and this actually was quite shocking. So in this paper, they were addressing this core problem, which is where in a lot of these benchmark data sets that these big tech companies are using to say, oh, look how amazing my model is, they actually use a different LLM to be the judge of answers.
Yeah.
So when they want to compare, say, these more creative capabilities, what they do is they say, right, write me a poem. They send that prompt to all the different LMs. They all get their answers, and then use a different LM to pick between the answers and say which one's the best. The reason for this is obviously because it's too expensive to get humans to read all 10,000 poems and pick the best one. So
take a lot of time as well.
Yeah. So they use an LLM to kind of cut this shortcut. So these researchers asked a question: well, what if the assessor LLM has a order bias? Maybe it prefers the first answer it sees, rather than any difference in quality. Yeah. So what they do is they kind of do this test twice and switch the pairs and see the difference in the responses. And what we find is that a lot of these chatbots, so such as ChatGPT itself, had a 38% order bias. So a lot of the time it would actually just pick the first answer it sees.
Interesting.
Llama scored quite high on this order bias as well, at 61%. And there are also other biases. So salience bias is where the LLM will just pick the answer that's the longest. And ChatGPT got a salience bias of 63%. So for all these benchmark data sets, if they use ChatGPT as the assessor, a lot of the time it just picked whichever answer was the longest.
Wow.
And lastly, bandwagon bias is where if you tell the assessor, 83% or some made up number prefer a certain response, it will just agree with you.
That one anyway.
So and ChatGPT's got an 86% bandwagon bias. So it's almost just showing that these benchmark data sets that are being released, these results from these benchmark data sets that are released on these PR stunts are really untrustworthy if they're using any LLM as part of that process.
Completely dependent on how exactly they're testing it. Well, very interesting, just as you're reading some of those off, I know these models are trained on human data, but all of those sound like very human traits that these models are kind of just replicating. So that's maybe unsurprising in a lot of ways.
Yeah, but I guess we have this idea that they're like this objective, soulless creature.
Which I think we really need to get away from, don't we? Yeah, exactly. I mean, as I said in that interview we did that one time, Riku, again, that I see AI as a mirror that, we're just getting more and more closer to a representation of ourselves rather than any oracle that is kind of better than us. So
Yeah.
So I guess on that note, that probably ties us perfectly into our kind of final segment, which is where are things going and what does this AI arms race mean? When we have all these different companies saying different things, their perceived technological progress that spurs others on, where could this all be going and why do we need to focus and pay attention?
So Kieren, What is a singularity and why is it important here?
I've been waiting a long time to talk about this, as you probably know.
Don't stop talking about it.
It is very relevant here. So a technological singularity is this hypothetical point in the future where in this context, AI surpasses human intelligence. And this is also often kind of communicated with this notion of, because it's so much more intelligent, growth of that technology then becomes kind of uncontrollable and irreversible because we're no longer in the driver's seat, because we can't understand what these models are doing, how they're doing it. And by essence of the term, a singularity, which kind of hints at this idea in physics as well, where we have a kind of tipping point beyond which we have a point of no return. The other notion, which if anyone knows anything of their physics out there, a singularity in physics is a black hole. And we have this similar concept that we can't see beyond the singularity because the intelligence is far greater than humans, and because things are moving so quickly, there is no way that we could ever predict what would happen after that point.
Yeah, so I guess with like a black hole, it's like people say like within a black hole, the laws of physics are different. So
Yep.
I guess in the same way with
Similar
AI,
notion,
like if it becomes super intelligent,
Yeah.
our ability to understand it is just insufficient.
Our understanding breaks down just as in the center of a black hole as well. It's commonly communicated along with this point where AI's intelligence surpasses human intelligence. This is the kind of key point. And the reason why we talk about singularity and why now it's becoming a very important thing to discuss is because we know how capable these models are now becoming and how capable they get when we just increase their size and the fact that we can make them smarter. And the central goal within the community of these companies and within AI as a technology is to just make these models more capable and smarter. You know, I think we've mentioned previously, but OpenAI's central mission is to build AGI, artificial general intelligence, and they define that as a technology and a system that is generally smarter than humans. China as well as a nation, they have this central goal of being an AI superpower and having the most intelligent AI by 2030. So, it's very, very clear, these companies and these countries are not hiding the fact that they just want to make the most capable and the best AI model. So I think by that definition, the singularity is coming. We will get to this point that it surpasses human intelligence if all of the investment and the resources are going to just make them smarter and smarter. They're already very, very close, if not smarter than the average human. So it doesn't seem infeasible that we could surpass human intelligence.
Yeah, do you remember that quote that Sam Altman said in a TED talk very recently? I think it was something that the interviewer was asking about what Sam would want the world to look like for their child that they've recently, I think Sam's just got a kid.
Yeah.
And he said he hopes that they always have a smarter being to go to.
Yeah.
So I think alluding to the fact that throughout the whole process of his child's life, there will be an AI that's always there, smarter than them.
They won't be the smartest creature in the world. Yeah, it's a very scary concept, and to kind of nonchalantly just discuss that on a TED talk, I think we should be concerned about that. And the reason why this is scary, aside from just the fact that we would no longer then be the smartest thing on the planet, is this idea of what's called an intelligence explosion. Sounds very scary, but this
sounds nuclear.
It does sound nuclear. It does sound very weapon-like. But this concept was first coined by a British mathematician known as Irving John Good, I.J. Good, in 1965. And
is it good news?
It's not great news.
Sorry,
Sorry. That's so bad. And basically the concept is that when we have something that is so intelligent and specifically this thing is able to understand itself and improve itself. So, this is exactly what we're doing with AI. We're teaching it to write code. It can build AI models as we get them to help us do in our research, I'm sure. And if they become smarter than humans and they then take the driver's seat with this AI development, we get this concept of something called recursive self-improvement. And when this starts happening at the speed of computers innovating and developing rather than the speed of humans understanding and adapting and learning, this could rapidly speed up very, very quickly the development process and the speed at which these models are improving, resulting in probably a triple exponential or something really, really quick in terms of how fast things change. And we get this explosion where these models, on a scale far faster than humans could ever develop them, they get much, much more capable and smarter to the point of super intelligence or beyond.
And just to ground this in something, I think the singularity was originally, as Kieren said, this kind of hypothetical idea. But if we just look back at the AI progress we've had so far, and let's say the singularity is at level 100, you could say that the AlphaZero moment, maybe that was getting from 0 to 1. We went from an AI that completely from recursive self-improvement became superhuman at Go and all the board games.
Yeah.
Then we had DeepSeek's kind of aha moment where they essentially had a chatbot without any human intervention learn on its own to do reasoning and solve lots of problems. So maybe with DeepSeek we're at 0 to 10. And as we know with development, getting from 0 to 1 is often the hardest thing. And getting to 100 is probably in many ways sooner than we think.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And, you know, with AlphaZero and the chess computer, it was able to get to kind of superhuman levels of chess. I don't think anyone has beat AlphaZero in a game of chess. Even grandmasters, the best chess players in the world, they cannot beat this chess computer now. So it is superhuman in its abilities. But luckily, it's confined and constrained to just playing games of chess. Now, what's scary with chatbots now is that they are getting superhuman at human language, natural language. And more specifically, something else which is very concerning is a big red flag that kind of futurists and technologists said throughout history is a capability we should not give to these models, is for them to code and for them to understand the language and the kind of context within which they are built, and therefore be able to improve themselves and code themselves. They are getting, I think most coders now use these models to improve what they can do, to improve and speed up their coding workflows. So they are getting superhuman at coding, and we're putting all these pieces of the puzzles together, and it really does not seem infeasible that this kind of recursive self-improvement could happen. It's purely a matter of constraints and whether we're putting the kind of railguards in place. But as you mentioned with DeepSeek, that isn't the case. You know, we're giving them the flexibility to learn on their own. The limitation there was probably compute power and the money that could be put into them. So if that barrier comes down, who knows where things could go with the intelligence.
I think maybe a saving grace or just one capability that is remaining is this idea of, can a chatbot independently push the boundaries of scientific knowledge? And a lot of scientific progress is about bridging ideas. So maybe there's a new technique in statistics, and then there's a new type of data, and then you do a study that bridges the two. And that counts as science. So you can think of like a pie, and you're drawing a line between things in a pie, and no one's ever drawn that line before. That gets to be science. But it's really the kind of breakthrough scientific discoveries are the ones that make the pie bigger. And I think so far, we haven't had chatbots be able to make the pie bigger. They're really good at this interpolating, this idea of merging ideas. But it seems like only humans so far are the ones that are making the pie bigger. So once a chatbot does have that ability to make the pie bigger, I think that recursive self-improvement is just going to take off.
And I wonder, I'd just put that back to you, because in my view, I do agree that that's the case. I think there was one tiny example recently that hints that we're close to that, where a paper that was, the research was done and then it was written up purely by an AI, was accepted into a peer-reviewed venue. But that was a very kind of small edge case. However, I'd put it back to you that maybe you would say, I'm not sure that was kind of a fundamental way in which they were trained and what they do, that might be the limitation there. But I would just imagine that's purely because they don't have access to the tools and have the flexibility and the freedom to do that research. But I think they are more than capable, and their kind of knowledge base is more than a lot of researchers and students. And therefore, if they're given the time and the compute and the freedom and the tools, perhaps, they would easily be able to do research, in my view.
Yeah, well, time will tell.
Time will tell. But just one last thing to say on this as well is that a concerning thing, and why we need to talk about this as a very real and possible outcome, is that, as we were discussing earlier with this arms race and all these companies kind of racing to get the most capable model, that gives a very clear incentive for these companies, to make their models very good at improving themselves, because it would help them win in that race. So there is a very clear motive there to get them good at AI R&D tasks and helping their engineers, as we've seen with the likes of Meta, that are kind of getting rid of a lot of their mid-level software engineers and replacing them with AI agents. Surely the motivation is to make it a very good AI agent at coding and better than a human. So
yeah, I heard Duolingo, the world's most famous language learning platform, are actively just firing people and replace. They have an AI first policy. So
it's happening with loads of companies. Yeah. It's very, very scary. Could this race push us too fast, and could it push us towards something very, very scary? Does it push us to therefore build in very rigorous safety frameworks? I sadly don't think that's what's happening. But yeah, why does this matter so much?
Yeah, I think this is pointing towards something that pointing towards why AI is so different to previous technologies.
Yep.
And if we think about previous groundbreaking innovations like the printing press, that we spoke a bit about this in our recent episode on AI taking our jobs, is that a lot of these innovations come top down. So there's a problem. Horses are slow. We need wheels and motors, and then you get the car. Or let's go to the moon. Like a very clear goal.
Yeah.
Okay, let's build a solution. Let's build the rockets and all the tech. Whereas with AI, we're actually building the cognitive ability to automatically solve general tasks.
Yeah.
This is actually a bottom-up approach, and that's what makes it fundamentally different to any historical technology. And this is a big deal. So what do you think about?
Yeah, I mean, there's some slight overlap there with our "Is AI about to take our jobs?" episode, because I guess, when you do that bottom-up approach and we develop something far smarter than humans, it lifts the ceiling of what's possible, but by essence, it's only possible to then do those tasks and those new jobs by an AI that's smarter than us and can understand them. But yeah, just to that point you made, that the fundamental thing that we're trying to solve here is intelligence and cognition. This is what makes humans special and separate to other living things on this planet. It's why we are the dominant species, is because we are the smartest species on the planet. I think we've done workshops where I put this picture on a screen of a tiger in a cage to kind of give some intuition about what we're trying to do here and why intelligence is very important. We are obviously not stronger than a tiger. I know there are very annoyingly these stupid discussions going on the internet, I think, at the moment about 100 people versus a gorilla or something. But I'm pretty certain every human would lose in a fight with a tiger. But we're able to put it in a cage and control that animal because we are smarter than it, because we have technology and we have these tools. It's not because we're stronger or we have these kind of physical traits. So, if we develop something that is smarter than us, why would we expect it, especially given it's trained on human data, to treat kind of less intelligent species any differently than we treat less intelligent animals and living things? So, just this concept of developing something smarter than us should concern us a lot.
Yeah, I think it was actually, I can't remember the name, but a really interesting observations. Can you give a single instance where a less intelligent being is controlling a more intelligent being? And there's only really one that this scientists could think of, which is the child and parent relationship. But what we can see clearly there is that there's almost like a very compassionate incentive, and in many ways the parent is kind of being selfish by looking after their child. So even then it's questionable. I can't think of any situation where you don't rely on compassion for this less intelligent being controlling a more intelligent being.
Yeah, exactly. And
do these AI systems have that compassion? So.
I think to carry on this analogy slightly, I guess when you have children who talk back or very much try to gain control or get in the driver's seat, the parent probably kind of puts them in their place slightly and puts some constraints there to teach them a lesson. So, our fundamental thing that we're trying to do whilst we're developing AI is to maintain control of it. And, we don't want to give over control to these systems consciously. But if it was far smarter than us, maybe it wouldn't let us do that.
Yeah.
This is all very scary and concerning, but what can we do and what should we be doing? So I think the first thing is to do exactly what we're doing here today, which is to just realize the stakes. I think we need much more of an active discussion and awareness from people using these models and funding these companies what the stakes are and what is this development and this arms race that we're actually funding by using these models. And the other thing that I think we need to be putting a lot of pressure on governments to do is to regulate and to really step in here, because we can see that so far, as we've had with social media as well, these companies are left to regulate themselves, and they kind of set the precedent for the safety frameworks and when something kind of oversteps the mark. We need third-party safety institutions and government bodies to regulate this stuff that are not profit-driven, and it's not in their best interest to kind of neglect safety at the benefit of capabilities and consumer products. So these are things that we need to push for as users, as people, members of the public. We need to really put pressure on the government and on these companies to do more.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you've made it this far in this episode, so clearly you've probably already been convinced about how important this is, and maybe at least after hearing this episode, hopefully so. So something that you could do is, of course, have these discussions with the people around you. And I think all of this change does start small. It does start in your local circle. And that's kind of our big mission with this podcast and our online brand is to raise AI literacy and promote this ability for everyone to engage in that dialogue and bring all their values to that conversation.
And stay the ship.
Yeah, and if you don't have the energy for that, well, of course, you can share the podcast, so we can do that for you.
Which
so
we'd also be very grateful for.
We'd be very grateful, yeah. So hopefully in this episode, we've communicated this driving force of all this crazy AI innovation and how it's kind of related to the past with these previous arms races, but also how it's completely different and in, I don't want to say it, but a much more scary version of it.
Yeah, no, I think we've wanted to do this topic for a long time. Maybe we've shied away from it as we've built up our podcasting skills and abilities, but I think now is a perfect time, scarily, that we need to start this discussion in a very practical way and realise that it's a very real problem that could be coming, and already we're in this arms race situation. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. Stay tuned, because I'm sure we're going to come back to this topic in the future. Our next episode, we're actually going to be starting a mini podcast series where we have 6 special episodes where we're collaborating with AI Bio UK Institute, and we're going to have 6 episodes that are dedicated to showing the landscape and communicating all the ways in which AI is being used in biology and the life sciences. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, thanks for listening. Please feel free to give us any feedback on our socials or contact at artificiallyeverafter.com, and check out our Patreon for extra bonus episodes and behind the scenes stuff. So thank you for listening, and we'll
catch you next time.